In the heart of New York City once stood 7 of the most extravagant mansions ever built, symbols of wealth, ambition, and power. Palaces crafted from marble, gold, and dreams. Yet today, they've vanished completely. This is the story of how 7 architectural masterpieces, built to last forever, disappeared without a trace. The day the marble fell. It was January 1948, and New York City was losing something irreplaceable. On Riverside Drive, the Charles M. Schwab Mansion, once one of the grandest homes ever built in America, was being torn down. The Schwab Mansion was no ordinary house. Finished in 1906, it represented the very height of American ambition, wealth, and power during the era known as the Gilded Age. Built by steel tycoon Charles M. Schwab, it featured 75 rooms filled with marble, bronze, and mahogany, materials handpicked and imported from across the globe. It was a place where money was no object, and luxury was standard. Schwab himself was a true rags-to-riches figure. Born into modest circumstances in Pennsylvania, he rose quickly through the ranks of Andrew Carnegie's steel empire, eventually becoming president of Carnegie Steel and later forming Bethlehem Steel. At the peak of his success, Schwab was one of the richest men in the world, admired and envied by peers who marveled at his seemingly unlimited fortune. And his mansion reflected exactly that: unlimited ambition and boundless wealth. But fortunes can fade as quickly as they rise, and Charles Schwab's story was no exception. Despite his tremendous business achievements, Schwab was known for his extravagant lifestyle, lavish parties, and reckless gambling habits. In fact, his spending became so extreme that even his vast wealth couldn't keep pace. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the ensuing Great Depression severely crippled Schwab's finances, and by the late 1930s, he was nearly broke. The mansion, once a symbol of his great success, became an unsustainable burden. Its annual maintenance alone cost a small fortune, and the economic realities of the Depression era made it impossible to sell. Schwab died in relative obscurity in 1939, leaving behind a mansion that nobody could afford or wanted to keep. After his death, city officials debated potential uses for the building. Ideas ranged from converting it into a museum or government building to using it as offices. But none of these plans materialized. Ultimately, the decision was made to demolish the mansion entirely, to make way for modern apartment housing. And so, on that cold winter day in 1948, New Yorkers watched as wrecking balls smashed through walls that had once hosted America's wealthiest families. Marble columns, once polished by hand, fell carelessly into piles of rubble. Bronze fittings and rare wood paneling were discarded without ceremony. By 1950, the lavish mansion had vanished completely, replaced by a modest apartment complex known as Schwab House, efficient, practical, but entirely without grandeur. Schwab's palace wasn't alone in its fate. Across New York, many similarly extravagant homes of the Gilded Age met the same end. Mansions that had once stood proudly along Fifth Avenue and Long Island's Gold Coast were demolished one by one, victims of changing tastes, economic upheaval, and urban growth. It's hard not to wonder how this happened. How did New York City, a city built on dreams, ambition, and innovation, allow some of its greatest architectural achievements to vanish so completely? How could the symbols of an entire era simply disappear, leaving behind almost no trace of their former glory? To truly understand these losses, we must first understand what these mansions represented. They were more than just buildings. They embodied a time of unprecedented wealth, creativity, and boldness. An era when millionaires and billionaires competed fiercely to outbuild and outshine each other. These homes were monuments to the dreams, ambitions, and excesses of the men and women who shaped America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet, almost overnight, those dreams turned into financial nightmares. Taxes rose, society changed, and priorities shifted. What was once considered a symbol of success became an unwanted reminder of excess. And when maintaining these colossal homes became impossible, New Yorkers chose practicality over preservation, modernity over memory. Today, as we walk the streets where these mansions once stood, we see little evidence of their existence. High-rise apartments and office buildings have replaced them, leaving few hints about what once defined these neighborhoods. And yet, the fascination remains. The desire to look back and understand why these buildings mattered, what they represented, and how their disappearance changed the city forever. Throughout this documentary, we'll explore 7 forgotten Gilded Age mansions. Homes your grandparents knew, homes that need to be remembered. We'll uncover the stories of their rise and fall, the people who built them, and the dramatic changes that led to their demise. Most importantly, we'll ask ourselves what lessons we can learn from their disappearance and what it means for the future of New York and other great American cities, because these lost mansions were more than just buildings. They were part of our cultural heritage, monuments to human ambition, creativity, and achievement. And perhaps, by remembering their stories, we can better appreciate and preserve what remains of our architectural legacy. In our next chapter, we'll journey back to the very beginning, the explosive, extravagant era known as the Gilded Age. It was an age when nothing seemed impossible, and the sky itself was merely a starting point. When Fifth Avenue became Millionaire's Row. To fully understand the incredible mansions that once defined New York City's skyline, we have to step back into the fascinating era known as the Gilded Age, a period stretching roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s. It was a time unlike any other in American history, marked by unprecedented wealth, extravagant lifestyles, and towering ambition. In many ways, this era laid the groundwork for the America we recognize today. At the heart of this transformation were men and women whose names we still remember: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Astor. Tycoons who amassed colossal fortunes through steel, railroads, oil, banking, and real estate. They were often called robber barons due to their ruthless business practices, but they were also celebrated as titans who defined what it meant to be successful in America. The growth of their immense fortunes paralleled the explosive expansion of American industry. Railroads connected distant cities, factories churned out products at rates previously unimaginable, and the rise of banking and finance reshaped global markets. In this brave new world, wealth wasn't merely accumulated, it was flaunted. America was becoming richer, faster than ever, and nowhere was this newfound prosperity more evident than in the architecture of the period. It wasn't long before the country's richest citizens turned their attention to building homes that matched their towering ambitions, and New York City quickly became the preferred showcase for these magnificent mansions. It was the nation's economic powerhouse and cultural capital, the stage upon which America's elite displayed their wealth and power to the world. By the late 1800s, Fifth Avenue had transformed from a quiet residential street into the most famous thoroughfare in America. The wealthy flocked to it, erecting palaces along its tree-lined sidewalks. It soon earned a new nickname, Millionaire's Row. The name alone was a statement, an unabashed celebration of financial triumph. But these weren't just ordinary homes. The mansions of Millionaire's Row were architectural masterpieces. Many of America's wealthiest families drew inspiration from Europe, especially France, importing an extravagant and elegant style known as Beaux-Arts. Named after the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, this architectural movement symbolized grandeur, classical elegance, and a belief that no expense was too great to create perfection. Beaux-Arts architecture emphasized symmetry, elaborate decoration, and grand proportions. These homes were designed to make an impression, not just on guests, but on the world. Each mansion was a statement piece, a visible demonstration of wealth, power, and sophistication. The interiors of these homes were nothing short of breathtaking. Marble staircases rose majestically beneath sparkling crystal chandeliers. Opulent ballrooms could accommodate hundreds of guests dancing beneath painted ceilings depicting mythological scenes. Libraries featured walls lined from floor to ceiling with rare books bound in leather and gold leaf, imported directly from Europe. Even private rooms like bedrooms and bathrooms received extraordinary attention, adorned with silk wallpaper, intricate woodwork, and lavish fixtures. But these homes weren't just beautiful. They were technologically advanced. At a time when most Americans lived without electricity or indoor plumbing, these mansions boasted both. Elevators whisked occupants between floors, heated swimming pools invited relaxation, and private power generators kept the lights shining brightly. To step into one of these mansions was to glimpse the future, a future of convenience and luxury unimaginable to most Americans. Yet, as impressive as the architecture was, what truly made Millionaires' Row legendary were the people who called it home. These homes hosted extravagant parties attended by presidents, foreign royalty, famous artists, musicians, and socialites. Invitations to these events were among the most coveted in America, symbolizing one's social status and influence. The parties themselves became legendary, setting the standard for luxury and taste throughout the nation. One of the most famous families of the era, the Vanderbilts, built several of these monumental residences, cementing their place as leaders of New York society. William Henry Vanderbilt erected the so-called Triple Palace along Fifth Avenue, a massive, ornate structure housing multiple branches of the Vanderbilt dynasty under one roof. His home became a symbol not just of personal wealth, but of family legacy and influence. And Vanderbilt wasn't alone. Other wealthy families followed suit, competing fiercely with each other to construct increasingly elaborate residences. It was a game of architectural one-upmanship, with each new mansion aiming to outdo the last. From extravagant facades decorated with columns and statuary to sprawling gardens designed by renowned landscape architects, every detail mattered. Every extravagance was carefully calculated. Yet beneath the surface glamour lay an uneasy tension. As these homes rose along Fifth Avenue, critics began to question their excess. Newspapers and reformers spoke out against the opulence, contrasting the luxurious mansions with the poverty and hardship faced by most New Yorkers. The disparities of wealth were stark, and the mansions on Millionaires' Row became symbols of both admiration and resentment. But criticism hardly dampened the ambition of the era. Families like the Astors, Carnegies, Morgans, and Rockefellers were busy reshaping America itself. Their investments transformed industries, their philanthropy created libraries, museums, and schools, and their homes set standards of taste and culture that endure today. Their mansions weren't merely houses, they were statements about what America was becoming: a global economic powerhouse, a land of immense potential and almost limitless ambition. However, as quickly as the Gilded Age arrived, it also began to fade. By the early 20th century, economic realities changed, and New York evolved rapidly. Rising property taxes, the encroachment of commercial buildings, and shifting social values led to significant changes along Fifth Avenue. Many wealthy families relocated uptown or to estates outside the city, leaving behind mansions too costly to maintain. Slowly, one by one, the great mansions of Millionaires' Row began to disappear. Some were demolished to make way for skyscrapers, hotels, and department stores. Others fell into disrepair or were converted for institutional uses. The grand ballrooms were partitioned into offices, libraries became storage rooms, and marble staircases fell silent. In a matter of decades, the majestic homes that defined an era vanished, often replaced by functional but soulless buildings lacking the character and charm of their predecessors. Yet despite their disappearance, these mansions left a profound legacy. They captured a unique moment in American history, a time when ambition was boundless, fortunes seemed unlimited, and society's elite shaped a vision of America that would influence generations. Today, when we speak of the Gilded Age, we still picture Fifth Avenue as it was, lined with monumental residences, bustling with elegantly dressed guests, and echoing with the laughter and music of parties that seemed to never end. In the chapters ahead, we'll journey into the forgotten stories of 7 remarkable mansions from this extraordinary era. We'll explore their creation, celebrate their beauty, and uncover the dramatic reasons behind their eventual downfall. And perhaps along the way, we'll rediscover something important about our history, something worth remembering and preserving for the future. Engineering for excess, inside the homes that changed America. To truly grasp the magnificence and sheer extravagance of the forgotten mansions of New York's Gilded Age, we need to understand something critical. These homes weren't just grand, they were revolutionary. At a time when most Americans still lived without basic amenities we now take for granted, the wealthiest families of this period were busy reshaping what it meant to live comfortably. They didn't just follow trends, they created them. They turned luxury living into an art form. Imagine stepping into a home in the late 1800s and finding not only exquisite beauty but cutting-edge technology at every turn. While most American households still relied on wood stoves for warmth, candles and gas lamps for light, and trips to an outhouse or public bath for sanitation, the mansions of Millionaires' Row showcased technologies decades ahead of their time. Private electric plants, elevators, air conditioning, and materials imported from every corner of the globe were not unusual. They were expected. Consider electricity, perhaps the most remarkable advancement of the era. While Thomas Edison's electric bulbs first flickered to life in Menlo Park in 1879, it took decades for electric lighting to become commonplace in American homes, but not in the mansions of the Gilded Age. Wealthy homeowners didn't wait for municipal infrastructure. They created their own. Each grand mansion was equipped with a private power plant that could generate electricity independently, illuminating hundreds of bulbs to dazzle guests at nightly galas. The effect was transformative. Nighttime became as bright as day, instantly elevating a homeowner's social prestige. But lighting was merely the start. Electrically powered elevators, once reserved for factories and hotels, soon found their way into these private residences. The introduction of elevators radically altered mansion design. Staircases, once central to architectural layouts, became ornamental rather than essential. Now, with elevators whisking guests effortlessly between floors, homes could grow taller and more imposing, boasting multiple levels filled with rooms designed specifically for leisure, entertainment, and display of wealth. These elevators were marvels of early engineering. Made of polished brass and mahogany, upholstered with plush velvet seating, and operated by uniformed attendants, these elevators weren't simply functional, they were symbols of status. For the families fortunate enough to own them, the elevator became a vivid representation of their position at society's pinnacle. Even climate control, now a standard feature in every American home, traces its roots back to the Gilded Age. Early forms of air conditioning began to emerge in these palatial homes, utilizing elaborate systems of chilled water and fans to cool entire rooms, creating comfortable environments during hot New York summers. At a time when most residents struggled through sweltering July nights with nothing more than open windows, these privileged households enjoyed perfectly controlled temperatures. They didn't just escape discomfort, they redefined comfort itself. Of course, no home symbolized wealth and taste without exquisite interiors, and here too, the Gilded Age mansions redefined what was possible. Materials imported from every corner of the globe adorned walls, floors, and ceilings. Rare woods, mahogany from the forests of South America, ebony from Africa, and exotic teak from the jungles of Southeast Asia were carefully chosen for their beauty, durability, and prestige. Floors were laid with intricate mosaic tiles imported directly from Europe, crafted by master artisans who treated every square foot as a canvas for their art. Marble, too, was integral to Gilded Age style. Prized Italian and Greek marble, gleaming white Carrara, dramatic dark-veined Nero Marchina, and delicate pink Cipollino were sourced at enormous expense and shipped across the Atlantic. Master craftsmen transformed these blocks into magnificent fireplaces, grand staircases, columns, and statues. The marble didn't merely decorate the homes, it elevated them, communicating the homeowner's wealth and refinement without uttering a word. Yet, beyond their aesthetic beauty, these extravagant materials presented an enormous engineering challenge. Architects and builders had to find innovative ways to support their immense weight and incorporate them seamlessly into mansion designs. Advanced structural engineering and steel framing, techniques that later defined modern skyscraper construction, were first employed in these luxurious homes. The very techniques pioneered here helped shape the city skyline we see today. Indoor plumbing was another groundbreaking luxury. In an era when many families fetched water from communal wells or pumps, mansions had entire plumbing systems supplying fresh water to bathrooms, kitchens, and even private indoor swimming pools. Hot water boilers powered heated floors and provided warm baths at any hour. The luxury of unlimited hot water, today something taken for granted, was once a privilege reserved exclusively for the wealthiest of Americans. Yet innovation didn't end with these physical comforts. The mansions of the Gilded Age also boasted cutting-edge communication systems. Early telephones connected rooms throughout sprawling homes, enabling instant communication between staff, family members, and guests. Intercom systems, revolutionary at the time, allowed owners to relay instructions effortlessly across vast residences. Even early home security systems were installed, ensuring safety through electric bells, alarms, and advanced locking mechanisms that made these residences not only beautiful, but secure. To ensure flawless execution, the richest families hired the best architects, engineers, and designers of their time. Renowned figures like Stanford White, Richard Morris Hunt, and the firm McKim, Mead & White created homes that weren't just fashionable, they were iconic. These architects and designers brought European influences into their creations, blending Renaissance, Baroque, and classical Greek and Roman styles into unique American expressions of wealth and power. The staffing required to maintain such luxurious standards was equally extraordinary. Gilded Age mansions were supported by small armies of servants, ranging from chefs and butlers to gardeners, chauffeurs, and footmen. Large estates often included separate living quarters for staff, complete with their own amenities. The homes themselves became intricate ecosystems, dependent on invisible workers who quietly ensured perfection in every detail. But these innovations didn't simply improve the lives of the wealthy, they gradually shaped expectations for homes across America. Technologies pioneered in mansions eventually trickled down into more modest homes, influencing residential architecture and engineering nationwide. Elevators, electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating, once exclusively the privilege of millionaires, gradually became mainstream, transforming the way ordinary Americans lived. Yet, despite their profound influence, these remarkable homes vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Economic shifts, changing societal values, and the relentless pressure of urban development combined to erase them from the city landscape. Their grandeur, once proudly displayed, faded into obscurity, leaving only fragments and memories behind. But why remember them now? Because these mansions weren't merely symbols of wealth. They represented a bold vision of American innovation and progress. They pushed technological and artistic boundaries, laying the foundation for the modern comforts we enjoy today. To forget them is to forget a pivotal chapter in our collective history, a moment when America dared to dream bigger and live grander than ever before. In our coming chapters, we'll take you deeper into the lives of 7 incredible mansions that defined New York's Gilded Age. Each has a unique story to tell, tales of ambition, beauty, innovation, and ultimately, heartbreaking loss. By rediscovering these forgotten homes, we reconnect with an America that once believed anything was possible. These homes weren't just extravagant, they were revolutionary. And their stories, though hidden beneath layers of dust and time, remain more relevant than ever today. The servant cities, life below the Gilded Age stairs. Above ground, the Gilded Age glittered. There were diamond chandeliers and rosewood staircases, music in the ballroom, and champagne cooling on silver trays. The men wore silk waistcoats. The women floated in gowns of imported lace. And the houses, those vast 60-room palaces we've explored throughout this documentary, seemed to function like clockwork. Dinners served on time, beds turned down, roses arranged just so, fires always stoked. But who made all that happen? Beneath the carved ceilings and velvet drapery, a parallel world hummed with quiet precision, the world of the servant class. This chapter peels back the polished surface of Gilded Age luxury to explore the massive invisible machine that kept these homes running. The servant cities that existed below stairs, behind doors, and beyond the gaze of the elite. Because if these mansions were palaces, then someone had to run the kingdom, and it wasn't the people living in the master suites. Let's start with the structure of the homes themselves. Gilded Age mansions weren't just big. They were carefully compartmentalized, often designed to conceal the work behind the wonder. In the grand homes of New York and Long Island, entire floors were dedicated to servants, lower basements, attic rooms, and tucked-away quarters accessible by back staircases and hidden corridors. There were separate hallways so servants could move unseen. Dumbwaiters, speaking tubes, and bell systems connected rooms like nerves in a body. The service wing operated almost like a hotel within a house, complete with laundry facilities, kitchens the size of restaurants, linen rooms, pantries, sculleries, and servant dining halls. In a mansion like Charles Schwab's 75-room chateau, there might be over 40 servants on staff, working in shifts to manage every moment of the family's day. They were the first to rise and the last to sleep. They worked long hours under immense pressure, and for many, the mansion wasn't just a workplace. It was home, albeit in the shadows. Who were these workers, known as people behind the curtain? The vast majority were immigrants, especially from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe. Many were recent arrivals who had left behind poverty and unrest for the promise of American opportunity, but instead found themselves folding linens or scrubbing marble under the constant scrutiny of head housekeepers and stewards. Others were African Americans, particularly in southern households and later in northern cities. Their roles often reflected deeply ingrained social and racial hierarchies, assigned the most physically demanding or least desirable tasks, with the fewest chances for promotion. Despite the class divide, the servant structure inside these homes was itself rigidly stratified. It operated with military precision. The butler was the general of the downstairs world, responsible for overseeing. Staff managing inventory, receiving deliveries, and supervising formal service. The housekeeper, often a stern older woman, controlled the female staff and was responsible for cleanliness, linens, and order in every corner of the house. Cooks and kitchen maids worked in sweltering conditions, preparing multi-course meals, often on coal-burning stoves, starting as early as 5 a.m. Footmen and valets handled clothing, shoes, hats, and luggage, often required to stand silently for hours, poised and presentable. Maids and parlourmaid staff were responsible for bedrooms, fireplaces, baths, floral arrangements, and the constant polishing of silver and wood. Gardeners and groundskeepers maintained hundreds of acres with manicured lawns and seasonal flower beds worthy of European courts. Each person knew their place. Orders came from the top and were passed down, room by room, until the entire house ran like a small-scale industrial operation. In many ways, it resembled a self-contained town with its own schedules, infrastructure, etiquette, and even politics. Despite working in homes filled with luxury, the servants' quarters were typically sparse and austere. Bedrooms were cramped, often shared, and located in windowless basements or attics accessible only by narrow staircases. Furnishings were minimal: iron beds, wooden washstands, hooks for uniforms. Their meals were scheduled separately from the family, usually before or after regular dining hours, and eaten quickly in designated staff rooms. The daily schedule was relentless. 14 to 16-hour shifts were common, especially around events or guest visits. And yet, for many, these jobs offered stability, especially compared to factory work or farm labor. Room and board were provided. For young immigrant women, in particular, domestic service was one of the few respectable paths towards self-sufficiency. Still, these workers were expected to maintain an impossible standard: flawless service, total discretion, and absolute invisibility. Life below stairs was governed by rules. There were no romantic relationships allowed between staff. There were dress codes for every role: white gloves, polished shoes, specific hemlines, speaking to a member of the family without being spoken to, grounds for dismissal. And yet, beneath this rigid structure, the servant class developed its own culture. Stories were passed between floors. Friendships, and sometimes love, flourished in secret. Staff supported each other through illness, stress, and abuse. Some homes had hierarchies so strict that first-floor maids would never even meet the cooks who worked in the basement. The emotional labor of service was immense. Maids often raised the children of their employers, forming bonds that were deep but publicly unacknowledged. Butlers were expected to carry secrets and scandals without ever revealing a hint. Many sacrificed personal freedom for the promise of continued employment and were dismissed the moment they became too old to serve efficiently. The fall of the Gilded Age mansions wasn't just a story of architecture. It was also the collapse of this servant ecosystem. When the Depression hit, many wealthy families had to downsize or eliminate staff altogether. Others moved into apartments or suburban homes where service was no longer practical. Some former servants transitioned into other jobs: nurses, hotel staff, caretakers. Others were left adrift, with no savings and no pension, having dedicated their lives to homes that no longer existed. And just like the mansions, their stories faded, buried beneath the legends of their employers. When we think about the Gilded Age, we tend to picture ballrooms and banquets, tiaras and tuxedos. But none of it would have been possible without the hundreds of thousands of workers who operated behind the scenes. The homes may be gone, but the legacy of those who cleaned them, cooked in them, and held them together deserves remembrance. They didn't leave memoirs or marble monuments, but they lived, loved, labored, and built the quiet foundation beneath America's loudest era of wealth. In the final chapters of this documentary, as we reflect on what these homes meant and what we've lost, we must also remember the people whose names weren't carved into gates or gilded above entryways, but who kept the lights on, the stoves hot, and the world spinning just beneath the floorboards. They were the servant cities, and the mansions could never have stood without them. The Steel King's Palace, Charles M. Schwab's Riverside Chateau. Constructed between 1902 and 1906, Schwab's mansion stood at Riverside Drive and West 73rd Street, overlooking the Hudson River. At a time when most of the city's elite still clung to the prestige of Fifth Avenue, Schwab boldly chose the Upper West Side, then considered unfashionable, for his palace. But Charles Schwab wasn't one to follow convention. He wanted to make a statement, and he succeeded. The mansion spanned a full city block. It featured 75 rooms, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a sunken garden, and private garages. A luxury at a time when automobiles were still considered novelties. The home also included a vast music room, a Moorish smoking lounge, an art gallery, and a grand ballroom that could accommodate hundreds of guests. It wasn't just a house, it was a city of its own, wrapped in limestone and crowned with turrets, gables, and copper domes that shimmered under the sunlight. To the casual observer, the mansion looked like something transplanted from the Loire Valley in France. That was no accident. Schwab had instructed his architects to model the chateau after the grand estates of Europe. The style blended French Renaissance with Beaux-Arts influences, complete with soaring ceilings, carved stonework, stained glass windows, and sweeping staircases. Visitors entered through massive wrought-iron gates into a world that had more in common with Versailles than with modern Manhattan. Inside, no detail was overlooked. Imported Italian marble adorned the hallways and bathrooms. Hand-carved oak paneling lined the walls of the library and dining room. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from 30-foot ceilings. One entire room was paneled in Circassian walnut, a rare wood sourced from the Caucasus Mountains, prized for its swirling grain and deep color. Schwab also had a keen interest in technology and spared no expense to outfit his mansion with the latest innovations. The home had its own private electrical plant to ensure uninterrupted power, a telephone system that connected various rooms, and advanced plumbing and heating systems that provided comfort year-round. At a time when many Americans still used outhouses, the Schwab mansion featured luxurious bathrooms with hot and cold running water, marble tubs, and gold fixtures. Yet the most remarkable thing about the Riverside Chateau wasn't the size, the materials, or the technology. It was what it represented. Schwab's home was more than a display of wealth. It was a defiant declaration. He was a man who had grown up in modest circumstances, the son of a German immigrant in Loretto, Pennsylvania. By age 35, he had risen to become president of Carnegie Steel. And when Andrew Carnegie sold his company to J.P. Morgan in 1901, Schwab played a pivotal role in the deal that created U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Schwab's reward was immense. He walked away with tens of millions of dollars, an astronomical sum in the early 1900s. But he wasn't content to sit quietly on his wealth. Unlike his former boss Carnegie, who moved into philanthropy and lived relatively modestly, Schwab embraced his wealth with gusto. He lived loudly, entertained lavishly, and gambled freely. It was said that he once lost $10 million in a single year at Monte Carlo. To Schwab, money was meant to be spent, and his mansion was the ultimate proof. He hosted countless extravagant parties at the Riverside Chateau. Politicians, foreign dignitaries, opera singers, industrialists, and artists passed through its halls. These weren't mere dinners, they were spectacles. Orchestras played into the early morning hours, and guests dined under gilded ceilings on menus crafted by European chefs. Champagne flowed like water, and floral arrangements were so elaborate they were flown in weekly from South America. But as the years passed, the world around Schwab began to shift. The optimism of the Gilded Age gave way to the sobering realities of the 20th century. The outbreak of World War I disrupted global markets. Social values began to change. The Roaring Twenties brought a new kind of wealth and a different aesthetic. And most significantly, the Great Depression dealt a crushing blow to Schwab's fortune. Despite his genius for business, Schwab had made risky investments and was never known for his financial restraint. As markets collapsed in 1929, so did much of his remaining wealth. By the mid-1930s, Schwab was deeply in debt. His extravagant lifestyle, once celebrated, now seemed out of place in a country reeling from unemployment and poverty. Yet, Schwab held on to his mansion for as long as he could. It had become more than a home. It was a part of his identity. But the tide was against him. By the time of his death in 1939, the once glorious estate had already begun to deteriorate. No buyers came forward. No institution was willing to take on its immense maintenance costs. The mansion that had once symbolized triumph was now seen as an albatross. In a decision that stunned many, the city of New York acquired the property after Schwab's death, and in the late 1940s, demolition crews moved in. By 1950, the mansion was gone, replaced by the Schwab House, a modern apartment complex that remains to this day. The only reminder of the lost palace is its name. The destruction of the Schwab mansion marked a turning point. It was a sign that the era of monumental personal estates in Manhattan was over. The values that had once defined the Gilded Age, flamboyant displays of wealth, monumental architecture, and the belief in legacy through grandeur, had faded into the background of a new, more pragmatic America. Still, for those who knew it, the Riverside Chateau was unforgettable. It was a masterpiece of engineering and imagination, a bold personal statement from a man who lived without limits. Schwab's mansion represented not just one man's dream, but the peak of a cultural moment when America believed it could build anything, own anything, and become anything. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace, a fortress for a fortune. If there was one name that defined the Gilded Age more than any other, it was Vanderbilt. And if there was one building that captured the full scale of their ambition, it was the so-called Triple Palace. Erected in 1881 by William Henry Vanderbilt, the son of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, this colossal estate wasn't merely a home. It was an entire complex. 3 interconnected mansions spanning the length of a city block on Fifth Avenue between 51st and 52nd Streets, stretching from sidewalk to skyline like a fortress of unimaginable wealth. No family of the time dared to match its scale. No visitor forgot its presence. At the time of its construction, Fifth Avenue was already transforming into Millionaire's Row. But William H. Vanderbilt wasn't content with a single grand residence. Instead, he commissioned what became one of the most audacious architectural statements of the Gilded Age. A trio of palatial homes for himself and 2 of his daughters, all housed in a unified and fortified exterior that projected power and permanence. The very idea of living side by side in such splendor in custom-built mansions joined by internal corridors and shared gardens spoke volumes about the family's cohesion and control. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace was among the first steel-framed private residences in America, making it structurally modern even as its exterior exuded old-world grandeur. The choice of steel wasn't simply technical, it was symbolic. It represented strength, innovation, and a forward-thinking vision of domestic life. At the same time, the design itself borrowed heavily from European influences, particularly the Renaissance and Gothic Revival styles. The resulting structure was both a showcase of engineering and a museum of art and culture. Each of the 3 connected residences had its own entrance, staff quarters, reception rooms, and ballrooms. William's own section was the largest by far and dominated the corner of Fifth Avenue and 51st. Its facade featured intricate stone carvings, balconies with wrought iron detailing, and massive arched windows framed in imported limestone. Inside, the rooms glowed with the golden warmth of hardwood, brocade, and polished marble. Perhaps most famously, the Triple Palace boasted what was often referred to, either in awe or hyperbole, as a mile-long ballroom. While the actual length didn't quite stretch that far, the ballroom did span an entire floor and could comfortably host hundreds of guests. It was adorned with gold leaf ceilings, hand-painted murals, and massive mirrors that created the illusion of infinite space. Its chandeliers, shipped from Venice, reflected light onto crystal glasses and the diamond-studded necklines of New York's elite. It was in this ballroom that some of the most legendary social events of the Gilded Age unfolded. Lavish dinners, concerts, charity balls, and society weddings all unfolded under its glittering lights. Presidents, diplomats, artists, and royalty mingled with the cream of American aristocracy, often under the watchful eyes of portraits depicting generations of Vanderbilts in military dress and fur-lined robes. The home was not just for show. It was also where William Vanderbilt conducted business. His office overlooked the avenue, and important financial decisions were made within those stone walls. But as with everything the Vanderbilts did, even business carried an air of performance. Visitors walked through halls lined with artworks from the old masters, before being received in a drawing room that looked more like a wing of the Louvre than a private home. And the art wasn't merely decorative. William H. Vanderbilt was one of the great American collectors of the 19th century. His galleries, open to select members of the public, featured works by Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Turner, and Corot. His collection helped define New York as a city of culture and set the stage for institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Frick Collection. But as with many Gilded Age monuments, the Triple Palace's glory was tied intimately to the man who built it. William H. Vanderbilt had inherited an empire from his father, the infamous Commodore, and grew it into one of the largest fortunes in human history. At his death in 1885, William was the richest man in the world, with an estimated worth exceeding $200 million, more than $6 billion in today's terms. And yet, for all its grandeur, the Triple Palace would prove to be fragile in the face of changing times. By the early 20th century, New York was already beginning to evolve. Fifth Avenue, once a quiet street of private residences, was becoming a commercial artery. Retail stores, hotels, and office buildings crept steadily uptown, displacing even the most powerful families. What had once been desirable for its prestige and proximity now became problematic. Privacy was harder to maintain, taxes were rising, and the next generation of Vanderbilts was less interested in maintaining a sprawling fortress in the middle of the city. The family began to move out. The daughters who had once lived in the adjoining residences married and relocated to their own estates. William's grandsons turned their attention to philanthropy, travel, and new homes elsewhere in Manhattan and on Long Island. The maintenance costs of the Triple Palace ballooned, and by the 1920s it became clear that the property had become more burden than blessing. In 1926, after several years of discussion, the decision was made to sell the Triple Palace. It was a moment that shocked New York high society. One of the great icons of the Gilded Age was being put on the market, not to be preserved or restored, but to be razed. Demolition began in 1927. The ballrooms, galleries, and private studies were stripped bare. Architectural fragments were salvaged by collectors and preservationists, but most of the material, stone, marble, wood, was destroyed or discarded. The space where art had once hung and orchestras had once played was reduced to dust and steel girders. In its place rose the flagship store for Bergdorf Goodman, a luxury department store that still stands today. Ironically, the site that once symbolized America's most private display of wealth was now transformed into a commercial cathedral of consumerism, where opulence was no longer reserved for a select few, but marketed to anyone with enough credit. And so, the Vanderbilt Triple Palace, once the crown jewel of Fifth Avenue, vanished. No official plaque marks the site. Most pedestrians pass by without knowing that one of the most extravagant homes in American history once stood there. But for those who remember, or care to remember, it's a powerful story. A story about ambition, inheritance, and the strange, fleeting nature of legacy. The Triple Palace wasn't merely a house. It was a monument to a time when Americans believed that wealth was eternal, that fortunes could be carved into stone, and that dynasties would last forever. In the end, the Vanderbilt's most grandiose creation lasted just under 50 years. Next, we'll examine what happened to the remnants of this architectural titan, and explore how even the mightiest homes couldn't withstand the currents of a city always moving forward. Because in New York, permanence is always temporary, and yesterday's palaces are often tomorrow's parking lots. The Glass Kingdom, Louis Comfort Tiffany's Fifth Avenue masterpiece. If Charles Schwab's chateau was a symbol of industrial triumph and the Vanderbilt's Triple Palace represented dynastic power, then Louis Comfort Tiffany's Fifth Avenue mansion stood for something entirely different: art. Art in its purest, most personal, and most innovative form. At a time when wealth was most often expressed through imported marble, lavish ballrooms, and opulent banquets, Tiffany used his fortune to create a home that was part residence, part workshop, and part living gallery, a place where creativity lived and breathed. Built in 1885 at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 72nd Street, the Louis C. Tiffany Mansion was a jewel box among fortresses. Unlike the monumental homes of industrial tycoons or banking barons, this mansion wasn't meant to overwhelm with size or shout with grandeur. It whispered refinement, it radiated sophistication, and above all, it told the story of a man obsessed with beauty, light, and transformation. Tiffany, son of Charles Louis Tiffany, founder of Tiffany & Co., was already a celebrated designer and artist when he embarked on the creation of his Fifth Avenue masterpiece. Known for his revolutionary work in stained glass and interior design, Louis Comfort Tiffany had developed a style that blended Art Nouveau, aestheticism, and an almost spiritual reverence for color and texture. His goal with the mansion was clear: to craft a space that fused architecture with artistry, a home that was not just lived in but lived through. To achieve this vision, he turned to renowned architect Stanford White of the legendary firm McKim, Mead & White. White understood theatrical spaces. He knew how to balance elegance with drama, and he worked closely with Tiffany to create a house that was both deeply personal and culturally groundbreaking. The facade was understated, a blend of Romanesque and Renaissance influences, but the magic happened inside. The mansion was famous for its 15-panel studio gable, a massive stained glass installation designed by Tiffany himself. The gable flooded the main stairwell and adjacent rooms with shimmering colored light throughout the day, transforming even mundane spaces into transcendent experiences. These were not just decorative panes, they were works of innovation. Tiffany had invented new methods for layering and texturing glass, creating opalescent effects that had never before been seen in domestic architecture. The home also included extensive glass workshops and studios, where artisans worked under Tiffany's direct supervision. These in-house laboratories were used to prototype new glass techniques, test light effects, and create custom commissions for clients ranging from churches to department stores. This made the Tiffany Mansion not only a showplace for finished works, but a functioning design incubator at the heart of New York City. And yet, despite all the craftsmanship and planning, the mansion was never static. Like its owner, it was always evolving. Rooms were regularly redecorated or redesigned to reflect Tiffany's changing aesthetic interests. Entire galleries within the house were devoted to rotating exhibitions of his own work and that of others in his artistic circle. In essence, the mansion served as a kind of living museum, one where the boundaries between art and life dissolved. Social life at the Tiffany Mansion was equally dynamic. The home quickly became a cultural hub, hosting art shows, musical performances, and literary salons. Guests included some of the most prominent figures in American arts and letters: Mark Twain, Henry James, and Edith Wharton, among others. Unlike the overtly hierarchical and formal gatherings in other Gilded Age homes, Tiffany's salons emphasized conversation, experimentation, and the blurring of high and applied art. It wasn't just a home for hosting, it was a home for exchanging ideas. But as the 20th century progressed, Tiffany's fortunes, like those of many Gilded Age icons, began to dim. The public's taste shifted toward modernism and minimalism. Art Nouveau, with its intricate, nature-inspired designs, began to be seen as old-fashioned. Demand for stained glass waned. His commissions slowed. And while Tiffany's reputation as a pioneer never truly faded, his financial resources did. Maintaining such a house, especially one so bespoke in design, was incredibly costly. The experimental glasswork required constant upkeep. The imported wood and stone weathered with time. The stained glass gable, for all its beauty, presented significant structural and climate control challenges. And worst of all, the Great Depression struck, severely affecting Tiffany's remaining income and forcing him to scale back his operations significantly. By the early 1930s, the Tiffany mansion had become a financial burden. Tiffany himself was in his 80s and no longer actively producing work. After his death in 1933, there was no clear plan or appetite for preserving the home. At the time, New York had no formal landmarks preservation law. Historical buildings, no matter how culturally significant, were at the mercy of market forces. In 1936, just 3 years after his death, the Louis C. Tiffany mansion was demolished. It's difficult to overstate the shock of this event to those who followed American design and architecture. This was not just another Gilded Age mansion. This was the private home of one of the nation's greatest artists. And yet, it was reduced to rubble in a matter of months. In its place rose a modern apartment building, efficient, understated, and completely anonymous. No part of the original home was preserved. Not the gable, not the studios, not the stairwells or salons. Today, if you walk past 72nd Street and 5th Avenue, you would never know that a masterwork of American decorative arts once stood there. But the mansion's destruction did not go unnoticed. It became an early rallying point for the idea of architectural preservation in New York. While no formal action was taken at the time, voices from the arts community, including curators from the Metropolitan Museum and the Cooper Union, began to push the city to take preservation seriously. These early efforts would eventually lead to the formation of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in the 1960s, fueled further by the similarly tragic demolition of Penn Station in 1963. In a sense, then, the Tiffany mansion's loss served a greater purpose. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most beautiful creations can vanish without vigilance. Its destruction helped plant the seeds of a preservation movement that would go on to save hundreds of buildings in the decades that followed. And yet, for all the good that came of it, the loss still stings. Tiffany's mansion wasn't just a building, it was an extension of his creative genius, a physical embodiment of his values, talents, and innovations. Its erasure left a hole not only in New York's architectural history, but in the story of American art itself. To those who remember, or who have taken the time to seek out its story, the Tiffany mansion remains one of the greatest what-ifs in the city's long list of lost treasures. What if it had been preserved? What if it had become a museum? What if future generations could have walked those light-drenched halls and seen firsthand what happens when imagination meets craftsmanship? In our next chapter, we move away from Manhattan and follow the Gilded Age out to the water, to a mansion by the coast that rose like a dream and inspired one of the most iconic novels in American literature. A house that, like Tiffany's, told a story far larger than its walls. One that, too, would disappear, leaving behind nothing but legend. Beacon Towers, the Gothic dream that inspired Gatsby. There are mansions that dazzle with their wealth, homes that command respect through scale, and then there are places that feel like they've stepped out of a dream. Beacon Towers, perched dramatically on the cliffs of Sands Point, Long Island, was such a place. Rising like a fantasy fortress over the Long Island Sound, it looked less like a Gilded Age residence and more like a coastal castle pulled from the pages of a fairy tale. Or, as history would later suggest, the kind of place J. Gatsby might have called home. Built in 1917, Beacon Towers was the vision of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, one of the most formidable women of the Gilded Age. Alva was no ordinary socialite. She was born into wealth, married into one of America's richest dynasties, and later emerged as a political activist and suffragist. But even as she fought for women's rights and social reform, she never lost her taste for grandeur. Her goal with Beacon Towers wasn't just to build another extravagant estate. It was to create a statement, a monument, a structure that reflected her fierce will, her artistic vision, and her belief in the power of legacy. The estate she commissioned was unlike anything else on Long Island's famed Gold Coast. Designed in a whimsical Gothic revival style with touches of Moorish and Renaissance influence, Beacon Towers was white limestone and fantasy incarnate. It stood tall and proud with pointed spires, arched windows, carved balustrades, and intricate finials. The roofline was jagged and complex, full of chimneys and turrets and crenellations that gave the house the look of a medieval castle transplanted into the American landscape. Yet for all its theatricality, Beacon Towers was built with cutting-edge comfort and design. It contained 60 rooms, each uniquely styled and filled with imported materials from Europe. Guests entered through a massive arched gateway into a sweeping courtyard where the house itself wrapped around the sides like the protective arms of a palace. The interiors were lavish, but never stuffy, more dramatic than Baroque. Walls were covered with tapestries and decorative plasterwork, while chandeliers of crystal and iron hung overhead, casting complex shadows across tiled floors and silk drapes. The property spanned more than 300 acres at its peak, and it had all the amenities one would expect of a Vanderbilt heir: formal gardens, reflecting pools, private docks, stables, and even a chapel. The views from the estate were breathtaking: open water to the north, rolling lawns to the south, and a perfect vantage point for watching the sun rise and fall over the Sound. This was not just a home, it was a theatrical stage for the performances of high society. Beacon Towers was intensely personal to Alva. She designed many of the interiors herself, often overruling architects and decorators in favor of her own bold instincts. She saw the estate not just as a retreat, but as a final architectural statement, an exclamation point at the end of a storied career in society and style. Yet by the mid-1920s, her focus had shifted. Alva had become increasingly committed to political activism and spent more and more of her time in Europe. In 1927, just 10 years after its completion, she sold Beacon Towers to a man whose public persona was as oversized as her own: William Randolph Hearst. Hearst, the newspaper magnate and real-life model for Citizen Kane, was no stranger to ambitious real estate. He was already building his now legendary Hearst Castle in San Simeon, California. But Beacon Towers appealed to his East Coast sensibilities. He expanded the estate even further, adding more rooms, importing tapestries and artwork, and filling the halls with medieval armor, antique furniture, and rare books. Under Hearst's ownership, Beacon Towers transformed from a theatrical mansion into a treasure vault. The estate became a hub of activity once again, entertaining guests from politics, Hollywood, and publishing. But as the years passed, Hearst too began to lose interest. The costs of maintaining such a sprawling property, especially one built in such a unique and aging style, became untenable. Hearst, burdened by debt and changing times, began to divest himself of many holdings in the late 1930s and 1940s. By 1942, Beacon Towers had been shuttered, its contents sold off piece by piece at auction. Then, in what by now had become a sadly familiar pattern for America's greatest mansions, Beacon Towers was demolished in 1945. The once proud silhouette of white spires and Gothic arches crumbled under the weight of wrecking equipment and disinterest. What had taken years to construct was gone in a matter of weeks. Today, nothing remains of the house itself. The land was eventually subdivided and developed into private homes. If you visit the area now, there are no signs, no public markers, no evidence that one of the most iconic homes in American history ever stood there. But Beacon Towers has lived on, not in stone, but in story. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who spent time on Long Island during the early 1920s, was inspired by the Gold Coast's excess and melancholy. While writing The Great Gatsby, he is believed to have used Beacon Towers as one of the visual models for Gatsby's mysterious mansion. The idea of a lonely, extravagant estate perched over the water, filled with lights, music, and the ghosts of lost dreams, parallels Beacon Towers in both structure and soul. In that sense, Beacon Towers became something even more powerful than a house. It became a symbol of longing, ambition, romance, and inevitable decay. It represented the illusion of permanence in a world built on change. It was the physical embodiment of Gatsby's unreachable green light. Unlike Schwab's mansion or the Vanderbilt Palace, Beacon Towers was never meant to be a monument to industry or dynasty. It was built out of vision and imagination, and that may be why it lingers so powerfully in our memory. Even as its stones were carted away and its gardens bulldozed, its myth endured. For some, its loss is deeply personal. Preservationists have long pointed to Beacon Towers as one of the great architectural crimes of the 20th century. Artists, historians, and Fitzgerald scholars have attempted to recreate its appearance through sketches and digital models. Yet for the wider public, it remains largely unknown, a forgotten castle, lost to time. And that is what makes it so poignant. In many ways, Beacon Towers tells the story of the Gilded Age more poetically than any surviving structure. It was audacious and artistic. It rose fast and vanished faster. It was filled with meaning, but always teetering on the edge of unreality. It was too beautiful, too eccentric, too symbolic to last. As we continue our journey through the lost mansions of the Gilded Age, we'll explore others that left their mark more quietly, but no less significantly. Homes that shaped literature, politics, and even the identity of the neighborhoods that replaced them. But Beacon Towers will always remain the castle that slipped through our fingers, the mansion that, for a brief time, made fantasy real. Land's End, the real-life Daisy Buchanan's mansion. Perched on the edge of Long Island's North Shore, with sweeping views of the water and a front lawn that stretched toward the horizon like a green velvet carpet, Land's End was more than just another Gilded Age mansion. It was a whisper of fiction made real, a house so graceful and evocative that it's widely believed to have inspired the home of the great Gatsby's Daisy Buchanan. Built in the early 1900s in the town of Sands Point, New York, Land's End was a white-columned Georgian Revival mansion, stately but unpretentious. Unlike the whimsical turrets of Beacon Towers or the massive grandeur of Schwab's chateau, Land's End didn't scream power. It exhaled elegance. Its lines were clean, its symmetry perfect, its whitewashed brick glowing softly in the afternoon sun. It was, quite simply, beautiful, and it didn't need to brag. But make no mistake, this home had pedigree. Rumored to have been designed by architect Stanford White, the same man behind the original Madison Square Garden and other New York landmarks, Land's End embodied the understated refinement favored by a certain class of East Coast aristocracy. Its location on Long Island's Gold Coast, just miles from the mansions of other industrial titans, placed it squarely in the elite circle of Gilded Age society. The house itself featured 25 rooms, including expansive drawing rooms, a grand central staircase, a paneled library, and large bedrooms with French doors that opened to balconies and the sea breeze. The dining room overlooked the Sound, offering views that on clear days stretched all the way to Connecticut. The manicured grounds included formal gardens, tennis courts, and a boathouse. The air was thick with old money, even if the fortune behind it wasn't splashed across newspaper headlines. Land's End was a gathering place for literary and political royalty. Over the years, its guest list read like a who's who of American high society. Winston Churchill, Theodore Roosevelt, and Ethel Barrymore were all known to have visited. It was a place where cigars were smoked on wraparound porches, where martinis were sipped on wide verandas, and where gossip and politics mingled like perfume and sea salt. But perhaps no guest or observer captured its essence better than F. Scott Fitzgerald. During the early 1920s, Fitzgerald lived in nearby Great Neck, just across the bay from Sands Point. He would have seen Land's End while sailing. He would have passed it on Sunday drives. And he would have understood, instinctively, what it represented. Not just wealth, but established wealth. Not just aspiration, but arrival. In The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald described Daisy Buchanan's home as cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. Critics and historians alike have pointed to Land's End as the likely model. Like Daisy herself, the house exuded grace but hinted at distance. It was the kind of home you admired from across the water, not necessarily one you felt welcome to enter. And that perhaps is what made it so powerful. It stood not only as a setting, but as a metaphor for everything Gatsby wanted and could never truly have. The real-life Land's End, like its fictional counterpart, existed in a delicate balance of beauty and decay. By the late 20th century, its prestige had faded. While it remained privately owned and still structurally sound, the pressures of time, maintenance costs, and shifting priorities began to bear down. Its gardens grew wild, its paint began to chip. The view remained, but the glamour dimmed. Preservationists took notice. Writers, historians, and Fitzgerald scholars called attention to the house's literary legacy. Surely, they argued, a mansion tied to The Great Gatsby, arguably the most iconic American novel, deserved protection. Some suggested turning it into a writer's retreat, a cultural center, or even a Gatsby-themed museum. But the property, valued more for its land than its legacy, was already being eyed by developers. In 2004, the estate sold for $17.5 million. Over the next several years, as the new owners struggled to find viable restoration partners or develop a preservation plan, Land's End sat quietly, decaying. Wind rattled the window panes. Ivy crept over the brickwork. Tourists and fans of Fitzgerald made pilgrimages to the site, snapping photos from the gates or nearby beaches, hoping to catch a glimpse of what had once been. Then came the final blow. In April 2011, despite public outcry, the house was demolished. Bulldozers arrived, and within hours, a structure that had stood for over a century, hosted heads of state, inspired literature, and echoed with decades of laughter and music, was reduced to rubble. News outlets captured the scene, white columns falling, the porch crumbling, the roof caving in. It was over. Why was it destroyed? The answer is frustratingly common. The land was too valuable, the upkeep too costly, the mansion too old. The incentives to preserve it were weak, and the rewards of redevelopment too strong. As with so many Gilded Age homes, practicality triumphed over memory. Today, the site where Land's End once stood has been subdivided into multiple plots. Modern mansions, larger, more sterile, and unburdened by legacy, now occupy the land. There is no plaque, no historic marker, no Gatsby-themed garden to honor what was lost. And yet, Land's End continues to live on, in imagination, in literature, and in the quiet sense that something irreplaceable slipped through our fingers. It was never the most famous mansion of its time, nor the grandest. But it mattered because of what it represented. A vision of America caught between elegance and illusion. Its destruction echoes the very themes Fitzgerald wrote about: the fragility of dreams, the inevitability of change, and the tragedy of longing for something that can never return. In the next chapter, we return to Long Island's Gold Coast to visit another forgotten estate, one that glittered with cinematic glamour, welcomed silent film stars and tycoons alike, and eventually vanished into obscurity. It was a mansion built not just to impress but to entertain, one whose dock once sparkled with lanterns and laughter, and whose halls now exist only in photographs and memory. Let's step into Pembrook. Pembrook, the showman's palace by the sea. If Beacon Towers was a dreamscape drawn from medieval fantasy and Land's End embodied East Coast literary grace, then Pembroke was pure spectacle, a bold and unapologetically glamorous estate that reflected the tastes and triumphs of the American entertainment industry in its golden age. At 60,000 square feet, the estate wasn't merely large, it was cinematic. And fittingly so, because its most famous owner, Marcus Lowe, wasn't just another Gilded Age tycoon. He was the man who helped invent Hollywood. Located on the shores of Glen Cove, part of Long Island's North Shore, Pembroke wasn't the first mansion on the Gold Coast, but it was one of the most visually stunning and culturally electric. While other estates projected restraint and lineage, Pembroke embraced modern luxury with showbiz bravado. This was a house built for entertaining, for dazzling, for reminding guests that they had entered the home of a man who turned Nickelodeons into an empire. Marcus Lowe, born to Jewish immigrant parents on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, came from humble beginnings. He began his career selling furs before entering the arcade and motion picture business in the early 1900s. By 1919, he had co-founded Lowe's Inc. a movie theater chain that eventually became the parent company of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. While he never fancied himself a creative like the stars he employed, Lowe had a gift for presentation, and Pembroke became the ultimate stage. Built in the early 20th century and expanded under Lowe's ownership, the estate stood as a striking white structure set against a dark green backdrop of pine, oak, and rolling lawn. But it wasn't just the size or materials that captured the eye. It was the geometry of the building. Clean lines, vast symmetrical wings, and large floor-to-ceiling windows that opened out toward the water. The house seemed built to frame the horizon, always keeping the guest's gaze fixed outward toward possibility. The grounds at Pembroke were equally majestic. Wide terraces led down toward a rocky beach and private lighthouse dock, one of the estate's most iconic features. Unlike the typical Gold Coast mansions that preferred stone garden fountains or Roman statues, Pembroke's dock featured a functioning miniature lighthouse, a romantic and theatrical flourish that made arriving by boat feel like stepping into a scene from a silent film. And indeed, film stars did arrive. Pembroke was a party palace, one of the few Gilded Age homes to cross over fully into the glamour of 20th century Hollywood. In the 1920s and 1930s, silent film icons like Gloria Swanson, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford were known to have visited. Dinners lasted for hours, followed by dancing, fireworks, and open-air screenings projected onto temporary screens set up on the lawn. It was said that when Lowe threw a party, everyone came, from Wall Street barons to vaudeville comedians. The mansion's interior was every bit as lavish as its guest list. It featured ornate Art Deco flourishes, grand reception halls, music rooms, and a ballroom where a full orchestra could play. The ceilings were high and coffered, the chandeliers bold and modern, the color palette vibrant rather than subdued. This wasn't a home clinging to European tradition. It was confidently American, forward-looking, and full of flair. Lowe himself was reportedly not a man of personal extravagance, modest in his dress, quiet in demeanor, but he understood that a setting like Pembroke amplified power. It wasn't merely a retreat. It was a branding device, a declaration that Lowe had entered the ranks of the nation's most influential men. Not through old family money, but through the rise of a wholly new industry, entertainment. In some ways, Pembroke marked a turning point in Gold Coast architecture. It bridged the gap between the high Victorian mansions of the 19th century and the sleek modernism of post-war America. It was built with old-world craftsmanship but infused with a Hollywood mindset. The house had grand staircases, yes, but it also had movie projection rooms, staff quarters designed for year-round service, and a layout that facilitated the kind of large-scale entertaining that defined the Roaring Twenties. But as always, time was not kind. Marcus Lowe died suddenly in 1927, before MGM reached the full height of its success. His heirs held onto the estate for some time, But like so many families in the post-Depression years, they found it increasingly difficult to maintain such a sprawling and expensive property. By the 1940s and 1950s, as suburban development began to reshape Long Island, Pembrook became a relic of a bygone era, a spectacular white ghost watching over a coastline that no longer valued its majesty. In the early 1960s, the estate was sold. Developers saw not a cultural treasure but prime real estate. And so, without much fanfare, Pembrook was demolished. The parties were over. The projectors were packed away. The lighthouse dock stood alone for a while, like a lonely beacon searching for ships that would never come. Then, it too disappeared. What replaced Pembrook? Subdivisions, roads, houses built without architects, neighborhoods that were neat and functional but lacked character or memory. To this day, few of the current residents know what once stood on their land. No plaque honors Low, no historical society fought to save the house. Unlike the more politically connected homes of the Vanderbilts or Astors, Pembrook fell quietly, like a film reel fading to black. But for those who remember, or who have stumbled across grainy photos or second-hand stories, the memory of Pembrook still flickers. You can almost hear the echo of jazz from the ballroom, the clink of cocktail glasses on the veranda, the splash of oars in the water below the lighthouse. Pembrook wasn't just another Gilded Age estate. It was a mirror of an America in transition, from old money to new industry, from European imitation to Hollywood innovation. It captured the spirit of an era when entertainment was becoming the country's greatest export, when ambition could be both artistic and financial, and when men like Marcus Lowe built kingdoms not of steel or rail, but of celluloid and dreams. In our next chapter, we'll visit yet another mansion built on dreams, though these dreams stretched even higher, up a hilltop in Roslyn, where a palace once crowned the horizon. A place where aristocrats danced, foreign dignitaries were entertained, and tragedy loomed just beyond the gates. Let us turn now to Harbour Hill, perhaps the most classically beautiful of them all. Harbour Hill, the mansion that crowned Long Island. If the Gilded Age had a summit, both literally and figuratively, it may well have been Harbour Hill. Towering above the village of Roslyn, Long Island, this palatial estate was more than just another millionaire's retreat. It was a declaration of supremacy, a blend of aristocratic aspiration and cutting-edge American ambition. Designed by legendary architect Stanford White and adorned by the fiercely fashionable Kitty McKay, Harbour Hill represented a moment in time when America didn't just match the old world's grandeur, it dared to outdo it. Commissioned in 1898 and completed in 1902, Harbour Hill was the vision of Clarence Hungerford Mackay, heir to a fortune built in mining and telecommunications. His father, John William Mackay, had struck it rich in Nevada's Comstock Lode silver mines and later helped form postal telegraph and commercial cable, challenging Western Union's monopoly. Clarence, born into a dynasty of enterprise and excess, brought that same competitive spirit to the task of building a home unlike any other on the eastern seaboard. And so he turned to Stanford White, perhaps the most sought-after architect of the Gilded Age, a partner in the famed firm McKim, Mead and White. White was at the peak of his career, known for bold visions that combined classical European design with distinctly American scale. Harbour Hill would become one of his crowning achievements, and tragically one of his last, as White was murdered in 1906 in one of the most scandalous cases of the era. The site itself was dramatic, a 375-foot-high hilltop with commanding views of Hempstead Harbor and, on clear days, even the distant Manhattan skyline. White designed the mansion in the Louis XIV French Baroque style, with a symmetrical limestone facade, steeply pitched slate roof, ornate dormer windows, and columned terraces. It looked less like a home and more like a chateau that had wandered out of the Loire Valley and lost its way in Nassau County. But if the exterior was regal, the interior was absolutely theatrical. Harbour Hill boasted over 100 rooms, including 40 bedrooms, grand salons, conservatories, and a marble-floored ballroom that could accommodate hundreds. The centerpiece of the mansion was the Great Hall, with its vast fireplace, carved ceiling beams, and views that stretched endlessly across the Sound. Yet for all of Clarence Mackay's ambition, it was his wife, Catherine "Kitty" Dewar Mackay, who left the deepest imprint on the home's interior. Known for her striking fashion sense and strong opinions, Kitty oversaw much of the decoration and furnishing of the estate. One of the most iconic elements was her personal marble bath, a massive custom-designed retreat carved from a single block of Italian marble, complete with gold fixtures, wall-length mirrors, and a domed ceiling painted in soft pastel hues. It was not only a sanctuary, but a symbol of a woman determined to claim her space in a world still dominated by men. Harbour Hill was more than just a residence. It was a stage for power. The Mackays entertained on a level that rivaled European courts. The most famous event in the estate's history occurred in 1926, when they hosted Edward, Prince of Wales, the future and short-lived King Edward VIII, for a ball that drew over 1,200 guests. The event included orchestras, fireworks, and a menu written entirely in French. Reporters camped outside the estate's gates. High society gossiped about it for months. The Mackays were not simply party hosts, however. Clarence was a generous patron of the arts and a key figure in the development of radio and cable communications. He also funded military relief efforts during World War I and helped finance the careers of prominent musicians, including famed tenor Enrico Caruso. His wealth and influence placed him at the center of both technological advancement and cultural refinement. But like so many stories from the Gilded Age, this one turned with the times. The Great Depression devastated the Mackay fortune. By the early 1930s, the cost of maintaining such a massive estate, especially one with over 250 staff, became impossible. Rooms were closed off. Gardens became overgrown. Kitty and Clarence separated, and the grand social world they had built together began to dissolve. Clarence Mackay died in 1938, having already sold off portions of the estate's land. The mansion lingered for a few more years, slowly decaying, its windows boarded, its gates rusting. In 1947, Harbour Hill was demolished, its stone walls brought down by wrecking crews indifferent to their historic value. The site was eventually developed into subdivisions. A water tower and suburban homes now sit where carriages once rolled, and no trace of the house remains above ground. The loss of Harbour Hill was significant, not just for its grandeur, but for what it symbolized. It marked the end of Long Island's Gold Coast era, a final breath of aristocratic splendor before the post-war boom reshaped the land with mass-produced houses, highways, and shopping centers. It represented a shift from old wealth to new practicality, from opulence to efficiency. Yet, for all its vanished marble and lost silk, Harbour Hill lingers in memory. Artists and historians have recreated its silhouette in paintings and renderings. Its marble bath was salvaged and now resides in the Roslyn Landmark Society, preserved like a relic from another world. Some fragments of carved stone were found in local gardens, used as benches or boundary markers, forgotten ornaments of a forgotten empire. Like the other mansions in this series, Harbour Hill's story is not just about architecture, it's about aspiration, how a young country bursting with energy and wealth reached for something bigger than comfort. These homes were not simply shelters, they were visions, declarations, sometimes even delusions. But above all, they were reflections of the people who built them, the times they lived in, and the future they could not stop from arriving. As we close this chapter and move into the final reflections of this documentary, we invite you to consider what these homes meant and what their absence says about the choices we've made as a society. Because in every demolished mansion, there's more than just stone and wood that disappears. There's a story, a legacy, a piece of ourselves. Summary: the rise of the American city, from horse-drawn streets to skyscrapers. As mansions like the Schwab Chateau and the Vanderbilt Triple Palace climbed skyward on Fifth Avenue, another story was unfolding just a few miles south. A story of overcrowded tenements, noisy factory floors, polluted water, and families packed six to a room. This chapter explores the broader context in which the Gilded Age mansions were built, the transformation of the American city, and the dramatic contrasts that defined it. While the Gilded Age was an era of immense private wealth, it was also an age of massive public change, and nowhere was this more visible than in the rise of the American metropolis. From New York to Chicago, Philadelphia to Boston, cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries grew at unprecedented speeds, reshaped by immigration, industrialization, and infrastructure. They became engines of opportunity and laboratories of inequality. Between 1860 and 1910, the urban population of the United States exploded. In 1860, roughly 20% of Americans lived in cities. By 1910, that number had nearly doubled. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia became magnets for both immigrants and internal migrants seeking jobs in factories, shipping, retail, and construction. New York City alone tripled in population during this period. It became a metropolis of islands, physically through its geography, and socially through its stark divisions between wealth and poverty. The very features that made New York so attractive, its ports, railroads, and manufacturing hubs, also made it a crucible of urban pressure. The infrastructure could not keep up. Streets designed for horse-drawn carriages struggled under the weight of trolleys, omnibuses, and eventually automobiles. Sanitation systems were overwhelmed. Housing became both a commodity and a crisis. As the mansions of the elite rose along Central Park and the Upper East Side, the tenement slums of the Lower East Side became among the most densely populated neighborhoods on Earth. Originally built as multifamily housing, tenements quickly devolved into overstuffed, airless, and often dangerous living quarters. It was not uncommon for 20 families to share a single water pump or toilet. Ventilation was poor, sunlight was rare, and infectious disease spread rapidly. Tuberculosis, diphtheria, and typhoid were common. Mortality rates were high, particularly for children. These buildings were largely occupied by newly arrived immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Many were fleeing poverty or persecution in their homelands, only to find themselves locked into a different kind of struggle in America. They worked in sweatshops and factories, sold goods from pushcarts, and built the city's physical infrastructure: bridges, tunnels, subways, and buildings. Social reformers like Jacob Riis brought attention to these living conditions with photo essays such as How the Other Half Lives, 1890, which shocked middle and upper-class readers with images of cramped quarters, sleeping children on cellar floors, and families eating meals beside open sewage. Riis didn't just document suffering, he forced a conversation about the city's responsibility to its poorest residents. While the working class navigated crowded streets and tenement stairwells, the city skyline began to shift in dramatic fashion. The development of steel frame construction and the passenger elevator enabled buildings to rise well beyond previous height limitations. In 1885, the home insurance building in Chicago, often cited as the first true skyscraper, stood just 10 stories. By the early 1900s, buildings like New York's Flatiron Building, 1902, and Singer Building, 1908, climbed past 20 stories. This architectural revolution reflected not only technological innovation, but also a new urban psychology: upward ambition. The skyscraper became a vertical expression of Gilded Age capitalism. Corporations wanted visibility, prominence, and a footprint that matched their ambition. For elites, these towers were modernity made manifest. For workers, they often meant grueling jobs in windowless offices or labor-intensive construction work under dangerous conditions. The city was not just growing outward, it was growing upward. And with it, the distance between classes grew more visible than ever. Class geography. By the 1890s, New York and Chicago had become cities of neighborhoods, each defined by class, ethnicity, and access. The Upper East Side and parts of Fifth Avenue were reserved for the ultra-wealthy. These were self-contained enclaves of luxury, with wide sidewalks, gas lamps, uniformed doormen, and private carriage entrances. The Lower East Side, in contrast, was chaotic, multilingual, and bursting with entrepreneurial energy and hardship. Midtown began to develop as a commercial zone, separating the residential elite from the industrial laborers. Across the East River, Brooklyn and Queens absorbed spillover populations, becoming hubs for working families and small industry. In Chicago, similar patterns emerged. The Gold Coast became a zone for the elite, while Pilsen, back of the yards, and Little Italy absorbed immigrants and meatpacking workers. The design of these cities reflected economic hierarchy, physically embedding class into the grid of American life. As cities expanded, so did the need to move people quickly. The Gilded Age saw major advances in mass transit, including electric streetcars replacing horse-drawn trolleys, elevated trains, first in New York, then Chicago, the planning of subway systems, most notably New York's, which opened in 1904. Mass transit revolutionized the city. It allowed workers to live farther from factories, reshaped residential patterns, and laid the groundwork for the rise of suburbs. It also reinforced divides. The rich could afford to live farther away and commute in comfort, while the poor remained tied to walking distance or packed streetcars. Cities became zones of mobility, but access to that mobility was deeply uneven. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw remarkable advancements in urban technology. Electric lighting replaced gas lamps, illuminating streets and enabling nightlife. Indoor plumbing and water purification improved public health, though often delayed in poorer areas. Telephones connected businesses and homes, though service was stratified. Department stores like Macy's and Marshall Field's redefined public space for women, providing a respectable reason to be out in the city. With each innovation, the city became both more modern and more segmented, every new advancement offering convenience for some, exclusion for others. As cities ballooned in size and complexity, public outcry grew. Reformers like Jane Addams in Chicago, Hull House, Lillian Wald in New York, Henry Street Settlement, and numerous muckraking journalists began to demand changes to labor laws, housing codes, public health, and education. Their work laid the groundwork for what would become the Progressive Era, which followed directly after the Gilded Age. Still, resistance to reform remained strong among elites who feared increased taxation, regulation, or interference with their lifestyles. By 1910, the American city was unrecognizable from what it had been just 50 years earlier. Horse-drawn buggies now shared streets with electric trolleys and motorcars. Tenements and towers stood side by side. In a single glance, one could see luxury, misery, invention, and tension. Cities had become both engines of American modernity and mirrors of American inequality. This duality, the contrast between Schwab's Marble Palace and Riis's slum photographs, between Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue and a Polish immigrant's railroad flat, is central to understanding the Gilded Age. The mansions didn't exist in a vacuum. They rose on top of, beside, and against the backdrop of a rapidly changing urban world, one shaped by hope and hardship in equal measure. The real reason why they all fell, the slow death of the Gilded Dream. As we've wandered through the halls and histories of these forgotten Gilded Age mansions, a pattern begins to emerge. One that's not just architectural, but deeply cultural. These homes didn't simply fall because they were old or because they were ugly, or even because they were unwanted. They fell because America changed, and the things that changed it, those so-called killers of the Grand Mansion, weren't dramatic. They weren't fires, earthquakes, or mobs with torches. They were quieter, legal, economic, inevitable, and together they chipped away at a way of life that once defined the upper edge of American society. Let's start with the most obvious and least romantic: property taxes. During the Gilded Age, the wealthy wielded enormous influence and paid relatively little to keep their properties. But as the 20th century rolled in, especially after World War I, local governments began to rely more heavily on real estate taxes to fund services for growing cities. Fifth Avenue, Long Island's Gold Coast, and the Upper West Side of Manhattan became increasingly expensive places to own, even if the buildings themselves were already paid for. Suddenly, a house that once cost $300,000 to build might cost $50,000 a year just to keep standing. And with heirs often more interested in liquidating than preserving, these homes became financial liabilities almost overnight. The Great Depression didn't help. The stock market crash of 1929 wiped out fortunes in a matter of weeks. Families who had spent decades building dynasties were forced to sell off art, land, jewelry, and yes, real estate. The labor-intensive homes of the Gilded Age, with their armies of servants, elaborate gardens, and expensive imported finishes, became wildly impractical in a time when the American public was lining up for bread. Even those who survived the crash financially often found it socially unwise to maintain such visible symbols of wealth. Grandeur suddenly was out of fashion. Then came car culture. As cars became affordable and roads more widespread, the social geography of America changed. No longer did the wealthy need to live in the heart of the city or in isolated coastal enclaves. Suburbs emerged as more convenient, private, and modern alternatives. The idea of a city mansion with a staff of 20 began to feel not just outdated, but inconvenient. The new generation of millionaires and cultural leaders weren't interested in inherited splendor. They wanted speed, technology, and freedom. The final blow came from the very ground beneath these homes: the sale of air rights. In cities like New York, the land itself became more valuable than anything built on it. Developers could buy not just a plot, but the legal right to build above a structure. And so, a mansion that had once taken up an entire block might be raised to make room for a 20-story office building or a luxury condominium tower. Zoning incentives and a lack of preservation laws encouraged this trend. Old mansions were described in terms like underutilized land or inefficient density. Beauty had no place in the developer's spreadsheet, and critically, there were no preservation laws to stop it. Until the 1960s, New York City had no legal framework to protect architectural or cultural landmarks. Every mansion in this documentary was demolished legally. There were no required reviews, no historical impact studies, no public hearings. If you owned the land and you had a plan, you could knock it down. Period. And so, one by one, the mansions fell. Some were sold off piece by piece, chandeliers auctioned, marble fireplaces shipped across oceans. Others were simply bulldozed and forgotten, with no artifacts saved, no photographs taken, no markers left behind. In many cases, even the families who once owned them were reluctant to intervene. A new century had begun, and the past was seen as clutter, not culture. But even as the homes vanished, the ideas behind them did not. They lived on, in novels, films, museum wings, and in the towering skyline of modern Manhattan, where their absence is still felt. Gilded glamour, fashion, etiquette, and the code of appearances. Among the towering mansions, marble staircases, and chandeliers of the Gilded Age, there was another system of architecture, less visible but just as rigid. This one wasn't built of stone or steel, but of expectation. It dictated how you dressed, how you spoke, how you entered a room, how long you could linger, and with whom. In a society where wealth had exploded faster than tradition could keep pace, the true marker of belonging was not just money, it was manners. This chapter explores the intricate world of fashion, etiquette, and social ritual in Gilded Age high society. For many, especially women, these codes were not just decoration, they were survival. In the late 19th century, America was undergoing massive change. Industrialists were amassing fortunes unprecedented in the nation's history, and new families, many of them self-made, were gaining access to wealth, power, and influence that had previously been reserved for old aristocratic bloodlines. But old money didn't always accept new money. To bridge the gap, newly wealthy families turned to a different kind of capital, cultural fluency. This meant acquiring not just art and homes, but behavior, learning the rules of society and performing them flawlessly. Fashion and etiquette became the primary tools for navigating this new social terrain. Knowing how to dress, how to dine, and how to make conversation at the right moment in the right tone with the right people became its own form of currency. And like all currencies, it was tightly regulated. Clothing in the Gilded Age wasn't just fashion, it was proof of status. For women, the stakes were especially high. Wardrobes weren't chosen for comfort or personal taste, but dictated by time of day, social occasion, season, and marital status. A well-born or well-married woman might change clothes up to 6 times a day, moving from morning dress to walking suit to luncheon attire to afternoon reception gown to dinner dress and finally to a ball gown. A single evening gown could cost the equivalent of a working family's annual income. These dresses were often custom-ordered from Parisian fashion houses like Charles Frederick Worth and included layers of silk, velvet, and lace, hand-stitched embroidery, imported feathers, and jewel embellishments. Corsets were required, not optional. Trains might stretch several feet behind the wearer, despite their inconvenience. Accessories were also essential. Gloves, fans, tiaras, shawls, brooches, and parasols all conveyed signals about taste, wealth, and rank. A woman's hands and face were never to be exposed in public without proper adornment. Jewelry, particularly diamonds and pearls, was reserved for married women in the evening, while unmarried women were expected to show restraint. Men's fashion, while more static, was no less coded. The correct tailcoat, waistcoat, cravat, and gloves signaled respectability. Hats were mandatory, as were patent leather shoes for evening events. A man wearing a dinner jacket at the wrong type of event could damage his reputation, and by extension, his family's. The result was a culture of visual discipline, in which dressing became a form of social strategy. The right outfit could open doors, the wrong one could close them. To maintain order within this highly stratified world, etiquette books and finishing schools flourished. Titles like The Lady's Book of Etiquette, Florence Hartley, 1860, and Social Life, Mrs. Sherwood, 1874, became bestsellers among the aspiring elite. These volumes covered everything from how to walk down a staircase without causing offense to how to address a visiting duchess. Finishing schools for young women, especially in the Northeast, taught proper comportment alongside languages and needlework. Daughters of the wealthy were groomed to be not only ornamental, but strategic social assets, capable of hosting, matchmaking, and navigating complex social hierarchies. Even social introductions followed rules. A woman could not be introduced to a man unless a mutual acquaintance made the arrangement. Calling cards were used to request visits, and failing to return a call within the expected time window could be perceived as an insult. Dinner parties came with their own script. The host controlled seating arrangements, conversation topics were regulated, no politics or religion unless the host permitted, and forks had to be used in precise European or American style depending on region and background. A misstep could mark one as an outsider, no matter how rich. Perhaps the most emblematic performance of this social machinery was the debutante season, the formal introduction of young upper-class women into society as marriageable individuals. A debutante was not simply announced, she was presented, often through a series of highly orchestrated events, private teas, luncheons, charity balls, and formal dinners. These culminated in her official presentation at a society ball, such as the famous Patriarch's Ball or Caroline Astor's private gatherings, where she was dressed in white, adorned with pearls or a family heirloom, and expected to represent her family's status with grace and decorum. Behind the scenes, this was a high-stakes affair. Mothers strategized social alliances. Invitations were managed with the precision of a political campaign. Daughters were often warned. One wrong word, one misstep, and your family's name could be socially tainted for years. Marriage was the goal, not simply for love, but for consolidation of wealth, titles, and reputation. These rituals echoed European aristocracy, but were adapted to the uniquely American mixture of Protestant modesty and capitalist ambition. Within these structures, women had little formal power, but enormous cultural influence. The mistress of the house set the tone of the home and managed its social calendar. She determined guest lists, planned menus, selected the staff uniforms, and oversaw how the family was represented in public. A single comment by a prominent hostess could elevate or destroy another woman's social standing. This system gave women of wealth a narrow but potent sphere of authority. Their reputations, taste, and hospitality were their weapons. They were expected to be decorative, deferential, and virtuous, but also clever, calculating, and always composed. Yet this world was also suffocating. The weight of expectation, the constraints of dress and decorum, and the lack of independence often led to private rebellion, quiet divorces, secret affairs, or philanthropic work that doubled as escape routes from the domestic stage. By the early 20th century, the edifice of Gilded Age etiquette began to crack. The Progressive era, followed by World War I, reshaped public values. Women entered the workforce. The corset lost favor. The debutante tradition weakened. Even fashion began to reflect new values, simpler lines, looser fabrics, and a rejection of rigid formality. Still, the echoes of that world survive. In luxury fashion, society events, charity galas, and the enduring appeal of old money aesthetic, we see the shadows of the Gilded Age code of appearances. For the women of the time, elegance was not just about silk and silver, it was a system of rules through which they negotiated power, visibility, and identity in a world built for men. In our next chapter, we'll descend from the salons to the steelworks, to examine the laborers and factories that powered the fortunes behind these rituals. Because for every ball gown and butlered dinner, there was a coal furnace, a textile mill, and a 14-hour shift waiting at the base of the American ladder. Legacy and what's next? What we save says who we are. The slow erasure of the Gilded Age left scars on the landscape, but also on the cultural psyche of a nation. By the time the original Pennsylvania station was demolished in 1963, New Yorkers had already witnessed decades of architectural loss. Schwab's mansion? Gone. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace? Gone. Tiffany's Fifth Avenue masterpiece? Gone. But it was the destruction of Penn Station, a civic cathedral of classical design, that finally shocked the public into action. We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. Ada Louise Huxtable, NYT Architecture Critic, 1963. That same year, galvanized by public outcry, the city passed legislation creating the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission with the power to protect historic buildings from unchecked development. It was too late for many Gilded Age mansions, but the tide had finally turned. Since then, a handful of interiors have survived, pieces of the past hidden inside the present. The grand ballroom of the Villard houses, now part of a hotel. The library of the Morgan estate, turned into a museum. The Tiffany windows that once illuminated a stairwell, now reframed in gallery light. But for the most part, the houses are gone. Their legacy survives not in brick and mortar, but in myth. We see them in Gatsby's green light flickering across the bay. We feel them in the echo of jazz in an empty ballroom. We walk past their former footprints on Fifth Avenue in Glen Cove in Roslyn and sense a strange displacement, like walking over buried treasure. What does this all mean for us today? It means we have a choice between endless redevelopment and thoughtful preservation, between seeing buildings as commodities or as carriers of memory, between a future defined by glass towers or one that weaves the stories of our past into the fabric of what comes next. Preserving architectural heritage isn't about nostalgia, it's about identity. It's about understanding the layers of ambition, taste, power, and innovation that shaped this country. When we let that history crumble, when we lose another mansion, another landmark, another physical piece of our story, we lose a part of ourselves. And yet, hope remains. Across the country, interest in preservation is growing. Historic districts are expanding. Digital archives are making the past more accessible than ever. Young architects are blending modern design with old-world techniques, and filmmakers, writers, and historians continue to resurrect these spaces through story. So as we end this journey through 7 forgotten Gilded Age mansions, we issue a gentle call to action. Look up, look around, ask what stood here before, and when you find out, tell someone. Because the buildings may be gone, but their stories still belong to all of us. And if we choose to remember them, boldly, deliberately, and with love, maybe we can stop losing the next ones.